Look, welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have with us today Dr. Roberto Filippello from the University of British Columbia. And we're particularly pleased because in the Visual Politics program, we've had a whole range of people from different disciplines with us. We've had people from international relations, from peace studies, from history, from anthropology, from art history, last week from geography. But we've never had anyone from fashion studies. So it's absolutely wonderful to have Roberto with us. And I will now, before we get into the actual topic, that is Roberto's forthcoming book on Dress for Dissent, Fashion and Textile Activism in Palestine, I will introduce and hand over to my co-host, Jamal Nabulsi, who is ideally placed really to talk about the issues at stake, because Jamal is in the very, very final stages of doing his PhD here at UQ on everyday forms of resistance in Palestine, and in particular the role that feelings, emotions, and affect play in these struggles. So Jamal, thanks for joining us. And of course, Roberto, thanks so much for joining us in our Visual Politics program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Roland. So I just want to start by acknowledging that I at least am joining from the lands of the Yugra and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Recognize that their sovereignty was never ceded and that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm going to start just by introducing Roberto. Roberto Filippello is a Killam postdoctoral research fellow and a teaching fellow in gender studies at the University of British Columbia. He specializes in queer and feminist fashion cultures. His writing has been published in a wide range of journals, including Criticism, Third Text, Fashion Theory, and Australian Feminist Studies. His edited volume, Fashion and Feeling, The Affective Politics of Dress, is forthcoming in 2023. And he's also currently working on his first monograph, provisionally titled Dress for Dissent, Fashion and Textile Activism in Palestine, which is in particular the text that we're going to be talking today, or about that research in general. And yeah, we're really excited to have you with us, Roberto. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is really exciting. I look forward to chatting with you.
So I think we'll get started just with a couple of broad sort of background questions about the research. So first of all, how did you get interested in the topic of the book?
Yeah, so well, I'll say a few words about the book just for the audience who's listening so they can. So Dress for Dissent essentially is a book that traces the emergence of a young fashion community amidst the turmoil of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, specifically in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, so from the mid-1990s up until today. And I guess the sort of red thread across the book, or even the overarching arguments, is that the creative practices of these young fashion designers and image makers epitomize a model of activism wherein queer and anti-colonial resistance, anti-racism, and environmental justice are deeply interconnected. So as to how I became interested in this project, how it came about, it came about actually out of a deep frustration with fashion studies as a field, which up until recently has focused almost exclusively on European context through Eurocentric representations and ideas. And I've always been interested in the margins, not in a reifying or reified ways, but rather how subjects, how marginalized people, how minoritized subjects who are relegated to the very margins of the dominant visual public sphere navigate those borders and their relationship to the state and to capitalism. So when initially some Palestinian and also Israeli friends pointed me to the work of some Palestinian fashion designers I was not afraid of, I discovered an entire scene, really. I discovered an entirely reality which is very much at odds with the common assumption within fashion studies about what Palestinian fashion is. So I would say that probably virtually every dress or fashion historian, when asked the question about what they envision when asked about Palestinian fashion, they would probably say a conservative, Palestinian traditional garb with some embroidery, and they would probably associate that with, I don't know, an image of suffering, women's embroidering in refugee camps. Of course, that story is really important for the history of dress in Palestine. But I was really interested in exploring how these young fashion designers were challenging that commodifying Orientalist representational narrative, and how their mere concern is to think about fashion in communal terms as a shared platform through which they can connect across gender, sexual, ethnic, and religious lines. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
So look, there's a lot of sort of issues that came up already in your kind of own initial outline of your project and your forthcoming book. Especially for me, sort of striking is the extent to which, as you say, fashion studies has been linked to a kind of a very Eurocentric tradition, very Eurocentric nature. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, we are a visual politics program, so we're interested in the politics, and fashion, of course, for most people at first sight, is not something that is particularly political, and of course it is, as you've already pointed out. So would you be able to perhaps outline a little bit more both how in Palestine fashion has become political, but also in your own field, is that something unusual? Do people sort of think it's unusual for a fashion studies scholar to look at the political dimensions of fashion? Is that something that's been well recognized? So maybe we can have a few questions and a bit of a dialogue about what is it that makes fashion in Palestine so political, as you already outlined.
Yes, so I think I would probably distinguish terminologically between fashion intended as a system, as a language, and or as industry, and fashion as used in common parlance, colloquially as a kind of synonym for dress and clothing, right? So fashion as a structure is inherently political because it is embedded and plays a crucial role in the political economy of every country, as well as in the relationships between them. So it suffices to think about the Rana Plaza disaster. We were all faced with this disaster in which we realized that the workshops in which those garment workers were working were really necropolitical spaces in which their lives were disposable. So that gives a sense of how, on a kind of like macroeconomic and on a global scale, fashion is political. Within fashion studies, the political dimension of fashion in the vast majority of cases has been associated with self-expression. I have a bit of a problem with that. I think the idea of self-fashioning as a political act rests on a certain neoliberal rhetoric of self-optimization, as well as on an assumption of an epistemological assumption of subjectification, which fails to take into account that not everybody, depending on their locales, their ethno-religious affiliation, their familial belonging, are free and have the chance or want to express themselves politically through clothing. So this idea of the relationship between politics and self-fashioning is rather common in fashion studies, and it's something that I challenge. Now, in truth, there have been historical examples in which clothing has been used collectively to stage sort of to express, to voice political consciousness in the face of oppression. There are many examples. In the case of my own country, in Italy in the 1970s, in the gay liberation movement, most of the street protests involved forms of what in the UK was called genderfuck or cross-dressing. And that was a way of kind of visually, provocatively, and even satirically challenge the kind of Catholic conservative ideologies that was normative in Italy. Now, in the case of history, what makes it political, the political dimension of fashion in Palestine is really long and sometimes rather ambiguous and contradictory. But I would say that Palestinians in general have a rather wounded attachments to clothing, because clothing is both a site of injury and a side of endurance in Palestine. So, for instance, clothes had been banned by, Israel because they were seen as a symbolic threat. They've been used by Palestinians as forms of resistance. They've been, clothed bodies, Palestinian bodies have been stripped off their clothing at Israeli checkpoints. Palestinians have used clothing to disguise themselves in a way as a way to escape from, the Israeli forces. And also clothes have been, disrupted and destroyed or abandoned during uprooting and evictions. So that gives a sense of the kind of like political, but also psychic and affective balance of clothing in Palestine. And if you want me to get into the more like historical dimension of it, I'm happy to kind of like trace a bit more accurate relationship, but I remain quite generic.
Look, I think Jamal might have a few questions about the historical dimensions and so on, because that's his expertise. But I'm wondering if I can ask a conceptual question first. Like, you bring up these really interesting axes. You have sort of the element of, as you said, for most of them, fashion is self-expression, but of course it's also political, it's also collective and thus political. It has these both dimensions of individuality, but also collectivity. You brought up the division of domination and resistance, that fashions can be part of domination, but also be part of a very kind of conscious form of resisting existing forms of domination. But I was wondering if you can say a bit more about a third sort of axis that I see, and that is about being a conscious choice, as you say, of people really in a conscious way wearing certain things, whether to signal resistance, whether to signal agreement, a certain form of identity expression. But some of these fashion things are also subconscious or pre-conscious, in the sense that, the gender dimensions of wearing clothes, often people don't consciously think about it all the time because it's part of a discursive regime that we're used to over many years and decades to wear. Can you say a little bit about how these two elements interact, the extent to which fashion is a subconscious, collective, deeply embedded, discursive kind of element, and to what extent we can use it or people use it more actively, more consciously as a form of resistance, and how these kind of two elements interact with each other?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, I guess it's quite nuanced and textured, and for sure, there is a relationship, of course, between politics and subjectivity, and people who participate in active protests and political protests. Of course, they could wear t-shirts with slogans, or even in everyday lives, and that might have a sort of political impact. That might say something about where you stand in the world, how you see yourself in the world, how you navigate the world. My problem is more with a discursive fixation on fashion as a means of subjectification, as I was saying. So the idea that through fashion you can kind of create your own political subjectivity on an individual level. So for sure, I would say both on a conscious and an unconscious level, we make choices that are to some extent reflective on how we already stand in the world. So kind of like, it's kind of ontologically already political to some extent. But I don't think there is I don't think the relationship between fashion and politics in terms of dressing on a daily basis is something that can have an impact in terms of community formation or in terms of developing your own political consciousness. That's something that I'm a bit hesitant about. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I feel like your questions were
that's good. I'll leave on to Jamal because
in a very basic way, but
Jamal really is our resident expert on Palestine, so I'll leave a few questions with him. I'll come back with a couple of conceptual questions after that, maybe. So
yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, really interesting responses. And I might bring you back to a point that you mentioned earlier and ask if you could dig a little bit deeper into like what historically the meaning of fashion has been in Palestine.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so first of all, the birth of the fashion and textile industry in Palestine goes back to the late 1920s, so during the British Mandate. What happened was that Jewish immigrants escaping Nazism, mostly from Germany and Austria, arrived in Palestine and set up the first textile plants with Jewish government agencies. And the Palestinian people who were working in these textile plants were essentially providing clothes, even like socks and underwear and all kinds of military equipment, to the British military, to the British army. So that already gives a sense of how, the industry, the fashion or textile industry in Palestine operated within an asymmetric relationship, with in that case, with the British. But during the Nakba, then there was, of course, like a huge dispersion of techniques and possibilities and time to make clothes. So the kind of clothes that, for instance, women in homes were used to producing and making and passing over generations and generations were no longer common, and their techniques were kind of dispersed for a while. Then in the 1960s, there was, I think, probably alongside the kind of like golden era of feminist militant participation in the struggle for liberation, there was a return of weaving practices all across Palestine. But then, for instance, again in the 70s, there was a step back, because when the permit orders were issued by Israel, allowing men to travel from the occupied territories into Israel within the booming construction field in Israel, the women who were left in the Palestinian villages were kind of hired, or anyway, like exploited really, by the Israeli apparel companies to make clothes through subcontracting arrangements. Then those clothes would be imported into Israel, and Israeli companies would attach an Israeli label onto this that specific garment. So there was a kind of like exploitation of a feminized or majority female labor force, as well as an appropriation of their work. But that does not mean that Palestinians ever ceased to, see clothing as an act of civil disobedience, as an art historian, Tina Sherwell, wrote. For instance, during the first Intifada of the late 1980s, a new kind of shawal dress, which is a typical kind of Palestinian garment, also known as the Intifada or the flag dress, was developed. And that kind of dress featured motifs that ranged from, the Palestinian flag to the Dome of the Rock Mosque, through, verses from well-known Palestinian poems, the word Philistine, all kinds of symbols that expressed the wearer's desire to symbolically, semiotically, and politically participate in the resistance. So fashion, and in particular embroidery, has always had a crucial role in terms of functioning as vehicle for the production and circulation of political messages within the Palestinian struggle for liberation.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, I mean, you've definitely touched on this then and earlier as well. But I might ask you to go a bit deeper into it. Like as someone who, personally, both in a scholarly and in a kind of practical activist sense, I'm very much committed to, Palestinian liberation. Like something I'm interested in with your work is how fashion basically might contribute to the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because it's actually to some extent at the core of also the historical period that I focus on in my book. So, and that allows me to sort of build on the previous question. So you're asking me essentially about today, right? And about the future. How fashion today or in the future could serve, could act in the service of the struggle for liberation. So I guess with the failure of the Oslo peace process and the crisis that it generated in terms of the entrenchment of the occupation, the building of the so-called separation wall, the Bantustanization of the West Bank, and so forth, young fashion creatives were essentially put in the position of having to face an architecture of occupation, as was famously called, within which it was extremely hard on a very practical material level to navigate, to make clothes, and to let these clothes circulate. So what these fashion designers, who happen to be also my research participants and my collaborators, what some of them did, for instance, was to develop a trustworthy network of collaborations with taxi drivers, Palestinian taxi drivers, who were granted the license plates that allow them to travel all over the place across Palestine. And so, for instance, these taxi drivers were tasked with, for instance, shuttling garments from all the different production facilities, like, I don't know, sewing factories, embroidery workshops, all across Palestine. And so that's one ways in which these young fashion designers could and can actually produce their collections. Others, for instance, have devised very acute and astute ways of minimizing the chances that the Israelis really at the Israeli post in the West Bank would inspect and damage their shipments. And I won't get too much into the details of how they're doing that, but this kind of ingenious ability of devising strategies for circumventing or eluding the very infrastructures of the occupation is, I would say, an ongoing form of everyday resistance that definitely defies, what Nadira Shulkin calls the physics of power, of Israel's theology of security. But I think, and that's something that probably, I believe, speaks also to your own research, Jamal, on an environmental level, fashion is also crucial. So, in the face of the ecocide that Israel has been perpetuated for a very long time through, spraying pesticides all over the Palestinian crops, steering fruit and olive trees, regulating access to basic resources, water that is often contaminated, and so forth. What these young Palestinian fashion designers are doing is to retrieve the indigenous techniques that, based on photographic evidence, up until at least the 1970s were active in Palestine, that their ancestors were using to produce clothes. And so, for instance, they would use insects and spices and plants that are native to Palestine and that can still be found in Palestine to dye fabrics. So for dyeing techniques, to develop techniques out of those elements, they're also sourcing local natural fabrics or upcycling dead stock fabrics so that those clothes can last longer. And, that also, of course, expresses a sense of their steadfast and relentless attachment to the land, an effective attachment to the land from an indigenous perspective. And also, if I can add something, there's also another level and domain within which fashion acquires a salient political meaning today for the purpose of the Palestinian struggle, which is the visual aspect in which this research group is very much interested. So in thinking about the fashion media, such as photographs and short films that are produced by these fashion creatives, what they do is really to articulate a new visual, I guess, a counter-hegemonic visuality that is very much at odds with a traditional conservative nationalist iconography of belligerent, virile, heteromasculinist militancy that is kind of embedded in nationalist rhetorical Palestinian discourses. So I hope I was able to address some of this concerns. So there are multiple levels on which really fashion operates politically today within Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for that insight. I might pass back to Roland to ask the conceptual questions that he mentioned before.
Yeah, look, I'm particularly keen actually in exploring some of the methodological issues that you might be facing or might have faced. In the sense that, just listening to, there's so many aspects about fashion, dissent, politics that you talk about. You talk about, the individual versus collective one, as we've talked about. You talked about the representation is to land, to indigeneity, to struggle. You talked about the political economy dimension of it, the extent to which this is part of an economy. You talked about the ecological dimension. There's so many dimensions to it. So I wanted to have a couple of questions perhaps and probe a bit more on how do you research all that, such a complex, multifaceted aspect. I mean, first of all, do you do interviews? Do you do participant observation? Do you do some form of archival work? Do you look at magazines? Where do you find the evidence? Do you do a discourse analysis, semiotics? So many kind of issues that you could look at. So how have you gone about designing your project and then sort of looking for the evidence and analyzing the evidence? It would be fascinating to hear if you can trace us back a little bit about how you have done that. So
Thank you. That has been, and still to some extent is, quite challenging. This was supposed to be an almost entirely ethnographic kind of project, which did not end up being, maybe for the best, because I'm not an ethnographer and I'm not an anthropologist, so it would have probably been a much worse book than it potentially will be. But I conducted some groundwork on the field in Palestine right before COVID hit. So I did some preparatory work, I made my initial connections and did some interviews with research participants right before COVID hit. Then with the COVID outbreak, as we know, it was very difficult to travel. It was nearly impossible actually to travel to Israel, Palestine. And so my research, I had to kind of reroute my research project toward a closer focus on media and visual culture, which turned out to be very interesting. And during this past couple of years, I plan to go back and do actually participatory observation, joining these fashion designers, and watching them working in their studios, in their atelier. So that will happen in the spring. But what I've been doing for the past couple of years is really conducting a lot of interviews remotely. So all of these remote interviews were made possible by the fact that I had already met some of these people, and through word of mouth, of course, I could reach out to many other fashion designers based in Palestine and or in the Palestinian diaspora, even though I'm focusing specifically on the West Bank and Gaza. So I conducted these interviews. The interviews are semi-structured, are very loose, or really enable the kind of open narratives in which I actually let the participants themselves kind of guiding me throughout my own research. That's something that I sort of train myself to doing, so that not to let my kind of voice, become, kind of overshadow, or I don't know, scholarly being potentially like intimidatory in some kind of way. So I learned a lot just by listening and letting me guide throughout the different aspects that we were interested in. For instance, I was not particularly invested, and I'm still not an expert in issues of sustainability and environmental justice, but one of the key questions that keep emerging, and one of the questions that they're still trying to kind of wrap their heads around in Palestine, these designers, is how can we make sustainable clothes, honoring our, indigeneity, on a land that keeps being brutalized by the occupation, like on a very practical but also conceptual level, right? So I started to research sustainability and environmental justice and some kind of like legislation that is at place, and how it differ, for instance, from what we understand as sustainability or ethical fashion in some Western countries. So I really let them guide me. And then I conduct, of course, visual analysis of a lot of material. A lot of zines that I look at are available online. So I do some social media analysis, or sometimes it's called ethnography, but mostly the visual analysis is the key aspect, I guess, the key element in terms of the methods that I use in addition to interviews. And in looking at images, I'm interested in particular, I'm interested in kind of like extracting the affectivity of the image, extracting the affectivity from the aesthetic forms of the image. There's this German queer theorist named Anke Engel, who used an expression recently, which was using images as affective research agents. And that really resonated with the way I think also like subconsciously I was analyzing the images. So I'm paying attention to the poses, the looks, the gestures, the expressions, the attitudes of the models, who also oftentimes happen to be the image makers or the designer themselves. But I also pay attention to the haptic qualities and properties of the clothing, because that can tell us a lot about the sustainability or unsustainability of the clothing. And my approach is to really believe that by paying attention to the affective within the aesthetic, we can have a glimpse, or we can find some traces of the very conditions, material conditions and affective conditions within which those clothes that are represented in the images were produced and circulated.
Fascinating. I'm particularly keen to kind of probe you a bit more on the visual analysis that you've mentioned. And maybe I'll give you a bit of background in terms of our field in politics, in visual politics. When we think of visual politics, most people think of photographs of movies, of video clips, basically of two-dimensional images that circulate, representations in the press, in social media. But more and more scholars, and that includes, for instance, my colleague Bill Callahan, stress that we really have to look, if you want to understand the visual dimensions of politics, we have to look not just at two-dimensional images, but also at three-dimensional visual artifacts and performances, at anything from military parades to national monuments, but also, yes, people, the kind of the clothes people wear. So these are not sort of two-dimensional images, but are three-dimensional images. And you seem to do both. You do, I have never heard that term, netography. That sounds like a very neat method. So you analyze visual performances, you analyze how people perform when they wear fashion, you analyze embroidery, you said, a variety of sort of basically visual performances, but you also analyze two-dimensional representations of these performances, you said, social media representations and so on. Yeah. So how have you handled these kind of different, because they require somewhat different forms of methods to analyze, to understand, especially if you look at the affective dimension of it. So how have you handled this move between two and three-dimensional sort of visuals in terms of understanding how fashion works and effectively and politically?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think I kind of adopted this hybrid or mixed methods as a result of really the kind of work that these designers and these image makers do. So for them, for instance, circulating images, even images that don't end up being published or that they don't end up on their websites, they really pay a great deal of attention to producing images that then they can circulate across social media. So of course I could not, avoid but, look at those images and try to analyze them. And for instance, even look at the kind of, at the captions that they add. That are often very descriptive. Some of these, I don't look particularly, for instance, at TikTok, but some of them, different generation from mine, but some of them really, are invested in TikTok as a platform through which to do political work, explaining, for instance, the history of the garments that they're wearing, how those garments relate to the history of occupation, to the current conditions of Palestinians. So they do a lot of that work online and through social media. So to some extent, I had to attend to that. But my own, trajectory and background is more in visual culture, in understood as kind of like visual and semiotic analysis of visual imagery. So I kind of had to combine the two, and I guess in the book, based on the different chapters and the different designers and image makers that I'm focusing on, I deploy one over the other, and so they take, I kind of like zoom in and out based on the specific case study. So it's a bit of a mix of methods, but everything, like the red thread in terms of methods, as I mentioned, is really the interviews, what comes up for them and how they're invested in all of this. They are also directly invested in all different kinds and methods of producing clothing and thinking about clothing. So I guess it's very challenging, but it's actually less challenging to do because it's really kind of building on how they operate. And by really looking closely at the way they operate, I'm also able to analyze things in a way that, through methods that kind of intersects with each other or that build over, one another.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Roberto. I might just, to close out the interview, might just ask you a final question about the contribution of your research. I mean, what do you hope ultimately, like, your research will achieve, and who do you hope that it will speak to?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I hope it will speak to my research participants. The main goal is for them not to be disappointed, really. So that it would speak to them and to their communities. I don't, that I don't mean their communities at large. This is a work that I'm producing in English. My research participants are all fluent in English, but of course there's no assumption that everybody in their communities would speak English and or would have any interest in reading the book. But for sure, their close-knit communities of other artists and even musicians perhaps might be interested. So I'm interested in actually reaching their community and, seeing my research participants find some kind of, satisfaction or reflection of what they're doing perhaps in the book. I think it will probably speak to activists within the BDS movement, within the global solidarity movement with Palestine. And scholarly speaking, because of the kind of, inherently complex and textured nature of the subject that is at stake, also the project is, as we've briefly mentioned, highly interdisciplinary. So it will probably, address fashion studies scholars in gender and sexuality studies, but also scholars in environmental studies and Palestine studies, as well as, for instance, visual culture. And in terms of the achievements of the book, I hope that, first of all, the book will provide an understanding of the different affective, aesthetic, and political meanings that fashion acquires in Palestine, showing that fashion can function in the service of a social justice agenda, and can actually function as a tool for community building and as a world-making device. So as a tool for world building, and on the level of social justice with regard to queer and feminist minorities and struggles, with regard to fair labor, with regard to the environmental injustices. And of course, I hope that I'll be able to kind of amplify the work that these designers are doing, because at least currently within, again, fashion studies, there's no research on contemporary fashion. And in general, Palestine, up until, relatively recently, with the special issues on queer affects, for instance, in, the Journal of Palestine Studies, GLQ, Middle East Critique, and so on, there wasn't really much discussion about contemporary queerness in Palestine. And Palestine has been seen, as we well know from an Israeli Zionist perspective, as completely detached and separate from queerness, right? But also fashion has been seen as completely detached from Palestine. So I guess what I'm trying to do is also to kind of like bring together understandings, complex political understandings of fashion in relation to gender and sexual identities within an anti-colonial framework, and to create a kind of conversation between fashion studies and Palestine studies.
I have several pages of notes here, and we could easily go on for at least a couple more hours talking about Roberto and his fascinating work. But I think we want to leave our viewers hungry, so they actually go and read the book when it's out, at this point, called Dress for Dissent: Fashion and Textile Activism in Palestine. So look, at this stage, I think on behalf both of Jamal and myself, we want to really, really thank you, and everyone at the Visual Politics program here at UQ. We want to thank you for your time, for your fascinating research, Roberto, and we all look forward to reading the book. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much to you. It's been wonderful, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to really share all of this about the work and the questions that you've asked. Thank you so much.